Few films have burrowed so deeply into the American psyche that their influence can still be felt decades after release, and Red Dawn is one of them. On the surface, it looks like a straightforward 1980s action film about teenagers fighting back against a foreign invasion. But beneath the explosions and the battle cries lies a story far more complicated, far more fascinating, and in some cases, far more dangerous than anything that ended up on screen. The secrets buried inside this production reveal a film that was shaped by Cold War paranoia, real government consultation, genuine physical danger, and creative decisions that permanently altered Hollywood itself. These are the stories that most people never heard, and they change everything about how you see this movie. The single most consequential thing Red Dawn ever did had nothing to do with its story, or its cast, or its politics. It happened in a boardroom, not on a battlefield, and its effects are still being felt every time you buy a movie ticket today. Before Red Dawn hit theaters in the summer of 1984, Hollywood operated with only 4 rating categories, and a growing crisis was quietly building. Violent and intense content was slipping through under PG labels, and parents across the country were furious. Steven Spielberg, who had just faced a storm of criticism over Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom and Gremlins, publicly pushed the MPA to create something new, a middle ground between PG and R that could accommodate harder-edged storytelling without shutting out younger audiences entirely. Everyone agreed something had to change. Nobody could agree on what. Red Dawn became the answer. It was the very first film ever released under the brand new PG-13 rating, and its brutal battle sequences, unflinching depictions of occupation, and relentless wartime intensity made it the perfect test case for an untested category. That single classification decision reshaped the entire industry overnight. Studios suddenly had a powerful new creative lane, and blockbuster filmmaking was never the same again. Every PG-13 film ever made since that moment owes its existence, at least in part, to the controversy this movie helped resolve. If the rating change wasn't enough to cement its place in history, what came next certainly was. Watchdog organizations began meticulously cataloging the film's on-screen violence, and when the final count came in, the number was staggering. Roughly 134 acts of violence per hour. That figure made headlines everywhere and detonated a nationwide debate about what mainstream cinema should be allowed to show. Critics, commentators, and parental advocacy groups seized on the data, demanding stricter oversight and questioning whether even the new PG-13 label was sufficient to protect younger viewers from content this intense. The controversy reached its peak when the Guinness Book of World Records officially recognized the film as the most violent movie ever made at that time. Television segments, newspaper editorials, and community meetings erupted with arguments about Hollywood's responsibility and the limits of acceptable entertainment. What nobody opposing the film anticipated was what all that outrage actually did to its box office performance. Every condemnation was essentially a free advertisement. Audiences who might never have noticed a movie were suddenly desperate to see what all the fuss was about, and ticket sales climbed steadily as the backlash intensified. The more people condemned it, the more people watched it. It was a lesson the entertainment industry has never forgotten. Long before any of this happened, the project that eventually became Red Dawn looked almost nothing like the film audiences eventually saw. It carried a different name and an entirely different soul. Originally titled 10 Soldiers, the screenplay was conceived as a restrained, introspective anti-war story. It was intimate in scale, focused on a psychological toll of conflict, and far more interested in the inner lives of its characters than in spectacular combat sequences. The early drafts were quieter, morally complex, and deliberately unglamorous in their portrayal of resistance and survival. Everything changed the moment director John Milius entered the picture. Milius, who was known throughout Hollywood for his enormous personality and completely unapologetic political convictions, saw something in the material that nobody else had. He expanded the scope dramatically, transforming a modest character study into a full-scale patriotic guerrilla epic. The invasion scenarios became more elaborate, the action sequences more ferocious, and the ideological message more aggressive with every draft. By the time Milius was finished, the finished film barely resembled its origins. What had begun as a meditation on the human cost of war had been completely reimagined as a visceral, adrenaline-charged call to arms that divided audiences and critics alike and made absolutely no apologies for doing so. The lengths the production went to in pursuit of authenticity extended far beyond script rewrites and location choices. When it came to consulting on how a foreign invasion of American soil might realistically unfold, the filmmakers didn't turn to military historians or retired generals. They went directly to former Secretary of State Alexander Haig, one of the most powerful political figures of the Cold War era. His involvement added a layer of credibility that almost no action film could ever claim, and what he brought to the table was extraordinary. According to accounts in the production, Haig's suggestions were even more extreme than what eventually appeared on screen. His scenarios reportedly pushed the story into territory that even Milius, a filmmaker with no shortage of boldness, felt crossed a line from patriotic thriller into outright jingoism. Some of his guidance was considered too intense, too inflammatory, too likely to alienate the audience rather than engage them. The fact that a former top government official took the film's premise seriously enough to offer detailed tactical input says everything about the era. This wasn't treated like a movie pitch. At the highest levels of political thinking, a foreign invasion of the United States was considered a plausible enough scenario to analyze and discuss in genuine strategic terms. The line between fiction and real anxiety had all but disappeared. The preparation that went into readying the young cast was equally serious and, by modern standards, remarkably brutal. Before a single scene was filmed, the actors were put through an intense military-style boot camp designed to strip away any trace of Hollywood comfort. They trained outdoors in rugged conditions, handled real weapons under professional supervision, hiked through harsh terrain, and slept rough in circumstances that deliberately mirrored what their characters would face on screen. There were no shortcuts, no comfortable trailers waiting at the end of the day, no gentle easing into the physical demands of the shoot. The experience was grueling by design, and the results were visible to anyone watching closely. By the time cameras actually started rolling, the cast carried themselves like people who had genuinely been through something together. The camaraderie on screen wasn't manufactured through clever editing or scripted moments of bonding. It was earned through weeks of shared discomfort, physical exhaustion, and the particular closeness that forms between people who have pushed through something hard side by side. The boot camp didn't just prepare them for the roles. It made the entire group dynamic feel lived in and believable in a way that no amount of rehearsal time could have produced. What that boot camp created in terms of chemistry, the mountains of New Mexico created in terms of raw, unvarnished authenticity. Filming took place in bitterly cold conditions that pushed everyone on set to their absolute physical limits. What audiences experienced as convincing winter survival scenes were often the direct result of genuine misery playing out in real time. Patrick Swayze bore the worst of it. During extended outdoor shoots, the cold became so severe that he suffered frostbite, an injury that reportedly affected him well beyond the final day of production. Unlike modern sets where medical teams stand ready at every turn and warming stations are never far away, these conditions were unforgiving, and the cast was expected to endure them with the same toughness their characters were supposed to embody. There was at least one undeniable benefit to all that suffering. When the characters on screen huddle for warmth or push forward through snow and exhaustion, the audience feels it with an immediacy that no special effect could replicate. The mountains delivered misery for free, and the film's gritty, bone-deep realism owes as much to what nature inflicted on those actors as it does to any choice made behind the camera. Not every scene that was filmed under those brutal conditions made it into the finished movie, and some of the most significant deletions left real gaps in the emotional architecture of the story. A romantic scene between Leah Thompson and C. Thomas Howell was designed to deepen the connection between their characters, adding a layer of vulnerability and genuine human feeling to the surrounding chaos of wartime survival. It was fully shot and fully intended to be part of the film. Studio executives ultimately decided it had to go, and their reasoning centered on pacing. The film's relentless forward momentum was considered its most commercially valuable quality, and the fear was that a slower, emotionally intimate sequence would rupture that rhythm in a way that audiences wouldn't forgive. There were also concerns about tonal consistency, about whether a tender, quiet, romantic moment could survive the company of everything around it without feeling completely out of place. The cut had consequences that quietly rippled through the rest of the film. Without that scene, the relationship between those two characters sits in a kind of emotional ambiguity, and certain beats later in the story lose the foundation they were originally built to stand on. It's the kind of invisible editing decision that reshapes an audience's entire experience of a film, without most viewers ever suspecting that something is missing. The dangers of production weren't limited to frostbite and harsh weather. In an era before digital effects could replace real pyrotechnics, every explosion was an actual explosion, set off near real human beings. During the filming of a large-scale explosion sequence, flying debris struck Charlie Sheen directly in the eye. The injury was serious enough to halt production while he received treatment and recovered, a stark reminder that the spectacle audiences were going to enjoy from the safety of theater seats carried genuine physical risk for the people creating it. For Sheen, this was his very first feature film role, and it nearly ended before it had properly begun. Safety protocols existed on sets like this one, but they couldn't account for every variable, every unpredictable gust of wind, every piece of shrapnel that traveled a path nobody had anticipated. The production pressed forward after Sheen recovered, but the incident was a clear illustration of what action filmmaking in the 1980s actually cost the people who did it. There were no digital safety nets, no CGI stand-ins, no technological buffer between the performers and the chaos of live explosions. The visceral quality that made those sequences so effective on screen was inseparable from the very real danger that produced it. The complicated human dynamics on set didn't end with injuries. A planned intimate scene between Patrick Swayze and Jennifer Grey was supposed to add emotional depth to their characters' relationship, but when the time came to film it, everything went wrong. Miscommunication and the grinding exhaustion of a demanding shoot created an atmosphere of genuine tension and discomfort. Neither actor could find the right tone, and what was supposed to be a straightforward scene became an increasingly awkward standoff that the filmmakers eventually abandoned rather than forced through. The discomfort didn't dissolve once cameras stopped rolling, either. The tension between Swayze and Grey lingered and carried into the rest of production in ways that were difficult to ignore. What nobody could have predicted at the time was that this difficult, uncomfortable dynamic between two people who couldn't quite find their footing together would eventually become the foundation for one of cinema's most celebrated on-screen pairings. A few years later, they were cast together in Dirty Dancing, and whatever complicated friction had developed between them on the set of a war film in New Mexico somehow translated into electric, unforgettable chemistry on an entirely different kind of screen. Among the production's most chaotic and strangely poetic moments was the filming of the parachute drop sequence. The plan called for paratroopers to land in precise, choreographed positions as part of a carefully staged invasion scene. Strong winds had entirely different ideas. Once in the air, the jumpers were blown wildly off course and scattered across the New Mexico landscape in ways no one on the ground had prepared for or could control. One jumper landed directly in a tree. Another drifted so far from the designated landing zone that he was temporarily detained by locals who genuinely couldn't tell whether they were watching a film shoot or something that required an emergency response. The production crew scrambled in all directions trying to account for everyone while chaos spread across the surrounding area. The irony was almost too perfect. The accidental disorder that botched parachute drop mirrored precisely the disorienting, unpredictable nature of the invasion the film was trying to dramatize. What was supposed to be a tightly controlled stunt became an unintentional demonstration of how genuinely chaotic an actual airborne assault would be. And the raw, unpolished energy that resulted made the sequence feel more convincing than any flawlessly choreographed version ever could have. The prop department's work on Soviet military hardware was so convincing that it reportedly attracted attention from people who should have known better than to mistake a film set for a geopolitical incident. The vehicles used to represent Soviet tanks were modified civilian machines, meticulously redesigned with carefully crafted turret shapes, authentic-looking painted markings, and period-accurate detail work that had to hold up under natural light from every angle. According to multiple accounts that have persisted for decades, the vehicles were realistic enough to attract the attention of intelligence officials who wanted a closer look at what appeared to be genuine Soviet armor moving through a small American town. Whether those stories have grown in the telling over the years is difficult to confirm, but the fact that they have never gone away speaks to the quality of the craftsmanship involved. For a mid-budget 1980 production with no digital enhancement available in post-production, that level of practical believability was genuinely extraordinary, and it gave the invasion sequences a weight and physical reality that no available technology of the era could have manufactured any other way. One of the film's strangest and most sobering stories involves a scene that was fully completed and then permanently removed because of a real-world tragedy. A deleted sequence showed invading soldiers entering a McDonald's and attempting to order food, an absurdist collision between military occupation and American consumer culture that was intended to inject dark humor into the story. The scene was cut following a mass shooting at a McDonald's in San Ysidro, California, which occurred just weeks before the film's scheduled release. Given the devastating timing and the deep public grief surrounding that event, including any scene set inside that restaurant chain became unthinkable. The decision was immediate, final, and entirely correct, but it permanently altered the film's tonal landscape. Without that moment of dark comedy, the movie plays as a more relentlessly intense experience from beginning to end, and a dimension of the storytelling that the filmmakers had carefully constructed simply vanished. The deleted scene remains one of the most discussed pieces of lost footage in a decade, a reminder that real-world events can reshape a film's final form in ways that nobody involved in making it could have predicted or prevented. The impact of production on the community where filming took place was something the filmmakers hadn't fully anticipated. When the crew set up in Las Vegas, New Mexico, and began staging large-scale invasion sequences in the streets, the sight of foreign military uniforms, armored vehicles, and controlled explosions unsettled residents in ways that went beyond ordinary curiosity. This was the mid-1980s, and the Cold War was operating at a fever pitch. The threat of real conflict didn't feel abstract or distant to ordinary Americans living through that period. Some residents who witnessed the production didn't immediately understand that what they were seeing was a film shoot, and the confusion they experienced was genuine and alarming. Fiction and reality overlapped in a way that gave the town a visceral, involuntary preview of the anxiety the film was designed to evoke. If staged warfare in a place that knew it was fake could rattle a community this deeply, the premise had clearly tapped into something that ran far beneath the surface of entertainment. Director John Milius brought the same uncompromising intensity to his approach to casting that he brought to every other aspect of production. During auditions for the female roles, he posed a single, deliberately uncomfortable question to every actress who came through the door. Could you catch, dispatch, and skin a bunny if your survival depended on it? The deliberate use of the word bunny rather than rabbit was entirely intentional, designed to maximize the emotional discomfort of the scenario. This wasn't a question about outdoor skills. It was a psychological stress test, a way of observing how each actress responded when confronted with something viscerally unpleasant and completely unexpected. Those who flinched, hesitated, or showed visible reluctance were reportedly dismissed without further consideration. Milius was looking for performers who could access a quality of toughness and resilience that couldn't be taught in any acting class, and his method for finding it was as extreme and unconventional as every other decision he made on this production. His personal conduct during the promotional period around the film's release was equally theatrical. Milius reportedly kept a firearm visibly placed on his desk during interviews, a calculated gesture designed to communicate exactly who he was and what he stood for before a single question was asked. He knew the film was going to attract fierce criticism, and he leaned into the controversy rather than attempting to manage or soften it. His confrontational public persona became inseparable from the film itself, and the two reinforced each other in ways that kept the project in the cultural conversation long after it would otherwise have faded. MGM's internal view of the project before its release was one of deep skepticism bordering on dread. Executives worried that the premise was too politically charged, too intense, and too niche to find a mainstream audience. Marketing teams struggled to figure out how to position a film about teenagers fighting a foreign invasion during one of the tensest periods of the Cold War, without either overstating its politics or burying them entirely. Some discussions reportedly centered on whether to soften the marketing to reframe the movie as a straightforward action adventure rather than the ideologically loaded war film it actually was. Then the film opened. Audiences showed up in numbers that caught everyone by surprise, and every cautious prediction evaporated. The studio had been bracing for a commercial misfire and got a solid box office performer instead, driven by a combination of Cold War anxiety, genuine curiosity, and the free publicity generated by months of controversy over its violence. The film's ending nearly looked completely different, and the version that was ultimately chosen fundamentally shaped how audiences remember the entire story. During post-production, alternative approaches to the finale were explored, including directions that were darker and more ambiguous, that left the fate of the characters shrouded in uncertainty. What the filmmakers chose instead was a memorial-style ending that shifted the film's register from relentless action spectacle to something quieter, more solemn, and more emotionally resonant. That tonal shift in the final minutes transformed everything that preceded it. Without that ending, the film might have been remembered as just another intense 1980s war movie. With it, the whole story becomes something more meaningful, a meditation on sacrifice and the cost of resistance that lingers in the mind long after the screen goes dark. Perhaps the most remarkable testament to the film's cultural penetration came in 2003, when the United States military named its operation to capture Saddam Hussein Operation Red Dawn. It was a conscious tribute from military planners who had grown up with the film and carried its imagery into their professional lives. Target sites were designated Wolverine 1 and Wolverine 2, borrowing directly from the fictional battle cry that had become embedded in American cultural memory. Fictional terminology from a mid-budget 1980s action film was being used in one of the most significant military operations of the early 21st century, and the people using it knew exactly what they were doing. Few films can claim that kind of legacy, where the line between entertainment and reality blurs so completely that the fiction becomes part of the language of actual historical events. The phrase itself, that two-word battle cry shouted by teenagers charging into combat, achieved a life in popular culture that nobody involved in production could have predicted or engineered. It broke free from the screen immediately and never came back. For decades after the film's release, audiences have shouted it at conventions, at cast members during chance encounters, and at each other in moments that had nothing to do with movies. It captured something universal about defiance against overwhelming odds, and that emotional charge proved completely independent of the film's specific politics or era. It passed from one generation of fans to the next on its own momentum, without marketing campaigns or anniversary releases to sustain it. Very few lines of dialogue in the entire history of cinema have achieved that kind of organic, self-sustaining cultural permanence. What keeps Red Dawn alive across 4 decades isn't nostalgia, though there is plenty of that. It's the film's strange, stubborn refusal to become irrelevant. Original audiences experience it as a direct expression of fears they were living with every single day. Modern viewers bring entirely different political contexts and entirely different anxieties to the same footage, and find that it still resonates, just in different ways. Questions about occupation, resistance, national vulnerability, and what ordinary people are capable when their world collapses around them don't belong to any single era. Every generation finds its own reasons to engage with them, and this film keeps providing the frame. That kind of adaptability across changing cultural landscapes is genuinely rare, and it's the real reason this movie continues to be discovered, debated, and argued about by people who weren't alive when it was made. The explosions have dated. The Cold War has ended. But something underneath all of it keeps pulling people back, and that something is what makes Red Dawn far more than some of its controversial, chaotic, dangerous, and endlessly fascinating parts.